Stop me if you've heard this one before. So one time a little girl and her mother are preparing a roast. And as her mother always does, she's cutting the ends off the roast. And the little girl, she's kind of interested in what's going on, so she asks, "Mom, why do you always cut the ends off the roast?" Well, her mother says, "You know what? Now that I think about it, I don't really know. It's just what my mother always did." So they turn around to her grandmother, happens to be right there, and they ask, "Grandma, why do we cut the ends off the roast?" Well, the grandma pauses and goes, "You know what? I really don't know. It's just what my mother always did." Well, now they're really curious, so they pick up the phone and call the great-grandmother off in Arizona. And they ask her, "Great-grandma, why do you cut the ends off the roast?" And you guessed it, she goes, "I really don't know. It's just what my mother always did." Okay, so now these ladies are on a mission. So they call their great-great-grandmother, get her on the phone. "Great-great-grandma, why did you always cut the ends off the roast?" And the great-great-grandmother says, "Well, it's the only way I could get it to fit in my pan." Okay, so what does this have to do with business? Well, let's consider the two sort of comedic ironies of this story. So the first is that the mother was doing something without even really understanding why she's doing it in the first place. After all, it's always been this way. Her mother did it this way, she does it this way, it's obviously the right way to do it. And so here she is going about a practice dogmatically following tradition without really understanding why it was done in the first place. Second, the conditions that brought about the practice in the first place, the size of the pan, has changed. However, because the family has institutionalized the practice of cutting the ends off the roast, the fact that the need has changed has kind of fallen off the radar. As a result, we've got this kind of comedic act going on. Somebody doing the same thing over and over for no reason, and yet not even understanding what the reason was in the first place. Now, I believe that when it comes to business today, this story can act as sort of a modern-day fable, because much of what we do today, we do because we've always done it, and yet if you ask somebody, why do we do it this way? The answer is probably, well, because we've always done it this way. So let me give you an example. Why are you paid every 2 weeks? Now, 100 years ago, it was common practice to pay somebody weekly and really with an envelope full of cash. But of course, it depended on the industry. In some industries, employees were not paid but once a year. But today, it's common practice to pay most employees every 2 weeks. But why is that? Well, frankly, up until recently, I didn't know, I didn't care, it's just the way it was. But that is the very same attitude as this mother had cutting off the ends of the roast. And so with that, why are we paid every 2 weeks? Well, the reason is that back in the 1930s and 40s, the government started to institutionalize things like Social Security and taxes and union dues, things of that nature. Furthermore, there was a war coming on, and the government needed money to fight this war, which means they wanted your money as quick as they could get it. And so this brought about the practice of paycheck deductions. Well, for a company to run all these deductions and so forth, kind of figure out the math, if you will, that takes a lot of work. And so companies got into the practice of paying employees every 2 weeks so that they could have the time to run these deductions properly. Okay, so that makes sense. But here's the thing. Technology has changed. It's no longer an arduous process to run payroll. In fact, we can pay employees every day if we wanted to. Some employers are even doing this today through apps like Daily Pay. Yes, you can get your pay daily. There's no need to wait 2 weeks. But you know what? It's the way we've always done it in the past. It's the way my father was paid. It's the way I'm paid. It's the way my daughter's being paid. It's the way we get paid. No, not necessarily. Things have changed. I could go on. For example, why is socialized medicine just fine for the elderly, veterans, and those with disabilities, but not for the American people in whole? Now, if you're going to tell me it's because we can't afford it, I don't buy that argument. We're the richest country in the world. Maybe it's because, well, you know what? The elderly and veterans and disabled, they can't really work, and so they can't earn insurance through their work. But here's the thing. How many veterans and disabled and people in their 70s do you see in the workplace today? That's right, a lot. Our workforce is full of the elderly and veterans and disabled. So it seems to me they're working just fine. Furthermore, that response assumes that the only way that we can get health insurance is through the employer, which means that the employers and big corporations have the power. Is this necessarily what we want to have in place? Or maybe it's time to start having these discussions. Here's another example. Why do I pay property taxes on my home, but I don't pay taxes on anything else that I own outright? Now, of course, when I bought my car, I paid sales tax, but I own it outright now, so I don't pay taxes on the car year after year. And before you tell me about registration, that's not the same thing. Registration allows me the right to use my car, but I don't have to pay it if I'm not going to use the car. On the other hand, whether I live in a home or not, I still have to pay property taxes year after year. Why is that? Or how about this? Why are tools like GoFundMe and Patreon considered legitimate fundraising activities, but panhandling is not? Now, in full disclosure, I have a Patreon account, and I also panhandled in my youth when I lived in Europe. I could go on, but you get the point. We earn and spend and live in an economy every day, and yet we often don't understand why we do the things we do or the conditions that brought these practices about in the first place. And that question is going to be a key driver in this video series. We're going to go back in time and look at what conditions brought about what practices and whether these practices are still valid today. However, I want to be clear on something. This is not a history class. Granted, we're going to start at the very beginning and kind of follow history chronologically and explore the philosophies of a whole litany of historical figures, but don't let that fool you. This is not about understanding history. This is about understanding economic and business practices today through the lens of the past. Think of it kind of like picking up the phone and calling our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and saying, "What the hell, man? Why do we do it this way?" And so I hope you'll join me as we apply a little bit of critical thinking to the day-to-day practices that guide our lives as we earn and spend and live in this economic world. I know, it sounds pretty dry, but I promise it's not. We're going to have a lot of fun. You'll enjoy it, so stick around. Until then, have a fantastic day.